I'm Director of Women and Gender in International Development at the Center for International Research, Education, and Development here at Virginia Tech. Lubina Barua is my graduate assistant. She's supporting the discussion series and there's a PhD student at the School of Education. So welcome to our virtual Women and Gender in International Development discussion series. This is our final event of the fall semester. And we're very happy that you could join us for Dr. Siera Vercillo's presentation and discussion. So as of this morning, when Lumbini last checked about an hour and a half ago, we had 68 people registered for today's event. And in addition to many diverse folks in the United States, we had people who said they would be joining us from 11 countries, including Canada, Germany, the UK, Korea, Lao Republic, People's Republic, Democratic Republic. And I'm going to stress the names of the African countries since her presentation is on Africa. So Kenya, Malawi, Rwanda, Togo, Uganda, and South Africa. So welcome to everybody. So please note, as you just got a message like I did, that our event will be recorded. And that is so it can be available on our website afterwards. And so if you're staying on, keeping your camera on, you're consenting to being recorded. You can turn your camera off if you don't want your image recorded. Okay, so the full calendar and any updates of this discussion series for the rest of the year will be on our website. Now, before I introduce our speaker, I want to read Virginia Tech's land and labor recognition and invite you to reflect on it. So Virginia Tech acknowledges that we live and work on the Tudelot-Monacan people's homeland, and we recognize their continued relationships with their lands and waterways. We further acknowledge that legislation and practices like the Morrill Act of 1862 enabled the Commonwealth of Virginia to finance and found Virginia Tech through the forced removal of Native nations from their lands, both locally and in Western territories. We understand that honoring Native peoples without explicit material commitment falls short of our institutional responsibilities. Through sustained, transparent, and meaningful engagement with the Tudelot-Monacan peoples and other Native nations, we commit to changing the trajectory of Virginia Tech's history by increasing Indigenous student, staff, and faculty recruitment and retention, diversifying course offerings, and meeting the growing needs of all Virginia tribes and supporting their sovereignty. We also must recognize that enslaved Black people generated revenue and resources used to establish Virginia Tech and were prohibited from attending until 1953. So through inclusive VT, the institutional and individual commitment to UPROSM, that I may serve, in the spirit of community, diversity, and excellence, we commit to advancing a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive community. So brief housekeeping notes. The discussion will last until approximately 45 minutes. The presentation will be 20 to 25, and then we'll have about 20 minutes of discussion and Q&A. All participants will be muted to enable the speaker to present without interruption. And you're welcome to post questions through the chat at any time, and I'll read them to our speaker at the end of the presentation. So we keep track of those, and we'll ask them in the order that they were posted in the chat. But if there's more questions after those in the chat, people can raise their hands and unmute themselves and ask the questions directly or make a comment. In order for our discussion to be as rich as it can be, we need everyone to be respectful and treat our participants with kindness and consideration without discriminatory behavior. So again, we're being recorded and you will have access to it via our website. In advance, I'd like to ask you to please answer the survey that we'll ask at the end, and you can tweet us by tagging us at WGB_VC. Okay, finally, to introduce our speaker. The reason you're here, Siera Vercillo is an adjunct professor and the Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council postdoctoral fellow at the School of Environment, Enterprise, and Development at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. Her research interests are broadly located in the fields of feminist geography, political ecology, and critical development studies, with a focus on agrarian and nutrition transitions, smallholder rural livelihoods, food systems, and household food security in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly northern Ghana. He holds a PhD in geography from Western University and other degrees from the Institute of Development Studies in the UK and the University of Toronto. He's published in multiple journals, such as AMPIO, the Journal of Rural Studies, Gender, Place, and Culture, and Third World Quarterly, as well as in Al Jazeera and The Conversation Africa, and has been working mainly in agricultural extension with smallholders in West Africa for the past decade. So the title of her talk today is The Gendering of Climate Change Scholarship in Africa. Please welcome Dr. Siera Vercillo.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I'm just going to share my screen because I have a PowerPoint presentation. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. So thank you to Maria Elisa and your team for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to speak for about 20 or 25 minutes. And then I'm really looking forward to a discussion of the literature more broadly. I should note that I am an adjunct professor at the University of Waterloo, as mentioned, but I've just switched to the University of Toronto at Scarborough. I'm working on a new research cluster, which is Sustainable Farming and Food Futures Cluster, and it's linking agroecology, plant biology, with food sovereignty, food systems, food markets, infrastructure. It's a new cluster, so that's something I'm working on as well. And this presentation today is built off of a series of talks that we gave last year at the American Association for Geographers annual meeting. And we had further discussion of this. So it's great to see that there is gaining interest on this topic. Now, this is part of a study, well, present today is a study that we published last year in Ambio, and it was a systematic review of the gender and climate change research related to the African continent. So we read pretty much everything published on this topic, and with our own lens, analyzed where there are gaps and trends. So we think that this paper is particularly useful for those researchers or students who are trying to figure out what are the trends in the literature, and then what are the potential gaps? How can we fill them? What are new projects, new questions, new methodologies? So you're welcome to read this study. And what I'll present today is just broadly our interpretation or where our position is in our analysis of this literature, the actual systematic search and review process that we took, a summary of that review, where we see the gaps and biases, and then proposed further investigations, which many of you, I'm sure, are also experts in your own right, and I look forward to discussing where you think we could take this research. So broadly speaking, gender and environmental scholarship is well established as being, the environment is socially constructed and a political thing, as opposed to just a neutral, objective, natural phenomenon. And what this scholarship does very well is looks at the interactions between humans and the environment. And throughout the evolution of this scholarship, we know that, or it's been well established, well proven and demonstrated how women's knowledge of the biophysical environment differs from men's because they experience the world differently. So through gendered norms and socializations, their values, roles and responsibilities, differentiation in access to different kinds of environmental resources and rights means that they have different interests, different knowledge and experiences of the environment, and therefore different values in how to conserve and interact with it or not than men. So any scholarship that doesn't look at things from a socially differentiated or gendered lens of the environment tends to take more of a biased look. So we need to look at things look at the environment from a social perspective. And so how gender this gender differentiation impacts the environment, how equality and women's empowerment is related to this, and then how it affects sustainability goals. And there are some of the major scholars that have certainly influenced me, as well as the literature. I've listed below if you're interested in reading more about this topic. Now, from our position as the three authors of this paper, we tend to be critical feminist scholars. So looking more at gender relations and critical feminist lens as opposed to liberal feminist lens. And so what critical feminist perspectives claim is that in this scholarship generally, even the ones that focus on women and women's knowledge and women's rights is that it tends to portray women either as victims of environmental change or environmental systems, or in contrast, as saviors of the environment. So they have the potential, the knowledge, the roles to conserve and save from human damage. Now, the problem with this lens, or the critique, is that it fits, this is a notion that's fitting within the patriarchal and capitalist systems and not transforming it. And so what ends up happening when this research or knowledge gets translated to policy and practice is that it's using women's knowledge and labor for sustainability efforts without addressing the causes of that vulnerability. And that ends up deepening their vulnerability. So it's not a matter of, it's not enough to just focus on women, but looking at power dynamics, structures, that is where we as authors in interpreting this research and analyzing this scholarship, what we're looking at it as. So gender to us is a situated, dynamic, and negotiated identity or positionality through norms and values that intersects with other positionalities. So not all women and not all men are the same, and their interactions are diverse as well. So the systematic search and review process that we took is briefly outlined here. And although this is technically replicable, so if you follow these steps, you might come to the same list of articles that we analyzed, but because of our positionality and our theoretical lens, our interpretation, our qualitative review of the types of sectors and theories might differ. So what we did is we searched for gender, climate change, and Africa in the Web of Science. So these three keywords in quotes, and came up with 276 articles that were published between 2004 and 2019. And we ended the study at 2019 which was the complete year of when we were able to finish reading all this literature. And we scanned for, initially what we did is we scanned for abstracts for false positives. So sometimes in the search process, there'll be articles that come up that maybe they have the word gender once or Africa once listed in their study, but it's actually not relevant at all to the study. And based on that, we removed 16 articles and analyzed 260 articles as part of this study. And our initial analysis was coming up with aggregates of when these studies were published, who was funding them, whether they were open access or not, and what the research methodologies were. And then conducted a more qualitative review on all the sectors that were analyzed and the theories. So I'm going to present what those aggregates and reviews are now. So our analysis initially after the review of abstracts came up with all the types of sectors that were analyzed mainly in the studies and came up with this list. And so after this list, then we developing this list, we went through each article and categorized the articles under various themes to help summarize the literature. So this is a multi-stage analysis that's grounded in the theories that we used and was iterative. So as we were analyzing, we would adjust as we went on. And as you can see here, there are many sectors or themes covered. There are some obvious ones that are missing. To further summarize this, the first study that we came across was published in 2004, but it wasn't until the 2010s where this literature focused on gender and climate change in Africa really took off, particularly after 2013. And maybe we can talk and try to think about why that might have been in terms of what was happening in the world or what was happening in academia. And what's relevant towards this is less than half of the publications are available open access. So even though a lot of the scholarship is produced for certain places or about certain places, it's not necessarily accessible for certain people in those places. Further, we noticed that there was quite a bias or a predominance of studies conducted in certain African countries as opposed to others. So the top research countries that have the green dots located on this map here of the continent. That includes Ghana, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Malawi, and South Africa, where there were many, many studies focused in those places. And what's interesting to us is that there were countries that are very populous on the African continent that are missing from this literature, or there are very, very few studies, such as, and some of these countries could be explained by the fact that we were looking at English-based studies and not French or Arabic studies. So countries like Egypt, Algeria, Sudan, Morocco, that might be a cause. We don't know, but it could be. And then what was interesting is that based on the index that there are countries that are most vulnerable to climate change with the least capacity to respond, those countries are not really featured at all in this research. So countries like Chad, Somalia, Central African Republic, Eritrea, DR Congo, Guinea-Bissau. So if you're looking to contribute to this literature, one major area right off the bat is to pursue studies in these areas. And I'm sure there's many reasons as to why there are no studies in this area, but it's part of the politics of publishing and research. And it's really about the power of priorities in this research. So thinking further about what are the trends in the methodologies of this research, we see that the majority take place at a local level. So many, many studies did comparative cases, usually within local communities, comparing between each other. They were the most common, and less frequently, they featured on the global, continental, regional, and national scales. So studies of climate change that focus very, very close at the village level and not necessarily what's happening at wider scales is a problem, because climate change is a broad phenomenon as well. And then the actual methodology itself, we saw some trends and biases. Many studies, about 25% focus on surveys, so structured surveys. 18% were individual interviews, almost 16% were focus groups, and other types of methodologies like mixing these methods, a ethnography or participant observation, and then there were much fewer studies that use these methodologies, as well as studies that used sort of climate science or satellite imaging, mapping. These things were fewer as well. And so what we recommend, just based on these aggregates, is that we need to grant funds perhaps to different kinds of agencies to conduct research, like national or regional agencies, to do more that might reflect diverse methodologies, diverse types of studies, and the level of analysis. Further summarizing based on where the funding for this was coming was really striking. And that is the fact that over 100 of these 131 articles, 80% was funded by global North agencies, particularly research funders coming from North America and Europe. And these tended to be federal or national level agencies. So something like USAID, German Federal Ministry of Education and Research, the NSF, the ESRC in the UK, and then international development related research and aid or donor driven research like DFID, the IDRC, and there was only one intergovernmental or international agency that really featured prominently in the funding, and that was EFAD. So that lent itself to thinking through the kinds of questions being asked, the purposes of the research, who the audience is, and that would shape the methodologies and so on, which I'm happy to discuss further. So in terms of getting into the themes that were covered in the literature, about 20% focused on agriculture, which is quite striking when you think just broadly about gender and climate change related to Africa. And 22% were focused on adaptation, many linking the two. So what does adaptive agriculture look like, and what are women's roles and responsibilities in this? So all the images I should add in this presentation come from the internet. They come from our searches and trying to understand different places where this research might be funding coming from and what it might be used for and the funders. So this image, for example, helps to explain the links in the literature between gender, climate change, and agriculture, where looking at gender differentiated impacts of climate change, the way climate change impacts agriculture, and how gendered roles impacts these two things. And one trend or limitation that we saw in this analysis from around 25% or more of these studies is that they tend to be very descriptive with very little analysis. So they identify the problem and that's it. So they use surveys to develop lists of adaptation strategies. So this is what women do, this is what men do to adapt to climate change through their rural livelihoods or agriculture in particular. And that's it. Even so far, many studies would call themselves doing a qualitative study, but really what they did is they used multiple focus groups and did a quantifiable exercise. So they asked women in a women's only group, what are your livelihoods? What are your adaptation strategies on the farm? And then they asked men the same thing, and they called that a qualitative analysis. Sometimes they combined these adaptation strategies with people's perceptions of a changing climate. So erratic rainfall, soil changes, heat stress. But they really embed what these strategies, these adaptation strategies, these perceptions, these risks with roles, understanding of gender differentiated roles or responsibilities, the relations between women and men, the access to and control over resources, and other dimensions of the way policy and interventions shape and are shaped by these things. So it's not really addressing the power structures, it's very descriptive. And as part of this literature, there's actually very little on social differentiation. Really, it's just a comparison of women and men. So only 15 studies, about 6%, had a social differentiation as a primary focus of their study. And these studies had a primary engagement with gender as a socially constructed power-laden identity. So these studies that focused explicitly on social differentiation did do a very good job at demonstrating how gender roles, responsibilities, and negotiations with women, between women and men, but also other structures and other groups in other institutions, different types of households in relation to a changing climate, including the intersectional dimensions of identity. So looking at gender, for example, with ethnicity or generation, there was some work on HIV status, comparing those who are single, married, divorced, and widowed. Some very, very good, but limited number of studies that do that intersectional analysis. So that points to the need for further studies that do this sort of social differentiation analysis. The themes that were strikingly absent in this literature, when I think of climate change scholarship, these are some of the themes that also come to mind. So work on coastal areas, on conflict. We talk about migrants and climate crises and the move of people and the cause of conflict, education, outreach, energy, and urban areas, urban planning, water, the focus on water and climate change and flooding and other things related to water. These were absent in this literature, or very, very few studies focused in this area. So in the literature on gender, climate change related to the African continent, these themes were not really covered that much. And so if you're looking to further research on this, there's a dramatic need in this area, in these areas. So just to conclude or discuss some of our summaries and aggregates based on our interpretation in our critical feminist lens, is that we see a prevalence particularly of individual or household level analyses. So these structured surveys, for example, or even even discussions of focus groups that really just do a sex disaggregated analysis, comparing women and men's perceptions and adaptation strategies. And they use that disaggregated summaries to then make judgments about whether someone is vulnerable or resilient, which from our perspective, jumps too many steps in terms of trying to explain what's going on. So the conceptualization of gender as socially constructed, as place-based or nuanced, and intimately associated with climate change and the environment is not really there. And what those jumps and steps do is they base their analysis on their analysis to call something vulnerable or something resilient or someone or a household or community is based on stereotypical narratives of norms, of roles, of resource access and control to explain or just to explain the descriptions that they're seeing, and not without actually doing that explanatory work. And that's also because of the types of methodologies that they're pursuing. So I include this image here, this cartoon I found on the internet, which struck me as sort of representing the consequences of this kind of research, is when you're sort of doing a tokenism or quota of doing this research on women and men and climate change research on the continent. And so you end up just including women, but not meaningfully including them. And that has a number of negative repercussions, reinforcement of stereotypes, and therefore of structures that do make people vulnerable. So the lack of justice-oriented and intersectional studies, there's an absence of investigations as well into the responsibility of wider institutions beyond communities, beyond the household, beyond individuals that causes their vulnerability in the wider structure. So what is the responsibility of the state? What are the responsibilities of the corporations? What are their roles in all of this? And what therefore are their roles in working towards gender equality or equity and environmental protection? And I think this is really indicative of the focus on individuals and households as a tenet of neoliberalism, which is a focus in this scholarship to resolve the issues of climate change for their own communities and households, and not the wider structures at play. And so we would recommend that we need to sort of shift the blame, shift the research questions as well to questions more broadly, to wider scales, also to the global north, and less just on research on the African continent or specific individuals to relate to wider scales and wider phenomenon. So more of an institutional lens as well. And reorient research on gendered perceptions, the questions, the values, to also those in the global south. So while you're doing wider scale analysis, not just focusing on questions that might be useful to development institutions or donors, or to also communities as well, and look at what their knowledge, what kinds of questions they would want to redefine their human nature interactions, as opposed to focusing on sort of the ends of the development industry. And I'd like to include this image here of the cuckoo clock, because I think what's discussed a lot, and what I saw as a trend in this research, and I see it more broadly in gender and climate change scholarship and policy and practice, is this focus on women's empowerment or individual empowerment. One of my biggest pet peeves is when a practitioner or policymaker, even a scholar, will say we need to empower women to do this. But that's actually theoretically impossible, because empowerment is something that comes from within. And you cannot empower someone else. They can only empower themselves. I think if we use that term correctly, if we did research in a more accurate way, resolve the structures that constrain someone, but also shape their agency to be able to move in these structures, that would lead to research that reflects the reality and more accurately, and therefore lead to solutions that would address the root causes. So that's the end of the presentation. If you're interested in learning about the details of this, please, I urge you to read the paper. And if you would like to discuss more, you're welcome to email me or reach out to me via my blog and Twitter. And I would like to say that if you're a researcher in this area and you have a chapter or a paper that you're looking to find a place for, or would like to gain more reflection on, we are thinking of developing an edited volume in this space. Several publishers have approached me interested in this topic because there's such little published at that book level, and especially articles that address some of what I've been talking about. So do reach out to me, and I look forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I have to say, I'm sorry, I called you Siera. That's my head. There's no two R's, and it's just, I just came back from Spain, and I love to say things in Spanish, but of course there are no two R's. So anyway, to get going with your questions, we already have 5 questions, and I'm sure we'll get more as we get going. So the first one is from Rebecca Gianotti, and the question is regarding the scale of studies. It seems locally based studies would be incredibly valuable given how much local context matters, but it sounds like this research paper didn't value the local studies as much. How would you the gap between needing to understand local context and larger scales that more closely reflect climate change?
Yeah, Rebecca, great set of questions. It was striking to us as well. And I will admit, my research also does this local context-based community comparative studies. And so I'm reading this going, oh, I'm just contributing to the same sort of biases in the research. And I think it's not to say that we don't need these studies because context matters. I think what we're implying is that it's not the only thing we need, and also how you relate that place-based research, that context, onto wider scales. So looking at how communities engage with wider political and economic systems, this sort of thinking of the feminist political ecology lens or approach of fitting the politics of the environment with the politics of gender and relating on how those communities and individuals interact at a wider scale. So that's what I would say about the value of context specific studies or community comparative studies. But more than that too, I think there are a need for other wider scalar analysis. But even those studies that do compare community level, they're not actually engaging with the place itself. So it's not enough to just ask individuals about what they do or how they perceive their environments. There needs to be actual more qualitative analysis and perspectives, descriptions to understand and explain why they do what they do. And that requires going to wider scales as well. So that's how I would address this seemingly contradiction or bias in the literature. Oh, Maria Elisa, you're on mute.
That's why I had this big fun thing. You were muted. Sorry. Okay. Anna Browser. Her question is about how the UN and other international bodies, such as COP27, include gender in climate change analysis and policy. Do you see these efforts having an impact in the literature? And if so, how?
So on the one hand, I'm tough to say they do not, because the level of analysis that we're seeing is at a local state scale, and they're not looking at relating that local scale onto the wider politics happening. So the kinds of conversations happening at COP, for example, or for example, even the UN's food reports that were just launched, how the rates of hunger have skyrocketed, aren't not necessarily reflected in the studies based on the themes covered in those reports. But that isn't really accurate, because we see a lot of the funding for this research coming from not necessarily United Nations agencies, but development institutions, so federal agencies, aid, bilateral, multilateral agencies, I guess. So I'm actually tempted to say they have a huge influence on the literature, and as a result, they may not address the broader politics. So questions of what's the responsibility of these institutions, or the institutions in the global south and how they relate to the global north and how they relate to the global south, and vice versa. But they are perhaps doing research for informing their programs and their interventions. That would be my assumption, because that would be my assumption, and also my interpretation of explaining why there is such a focus in the scholarship with certain kinds of questions, certain levels of analysis, and certain methodologies.
Okay, thank you. Now from Suchitra Samantha, she asks, could you give us some examples of adaptation strategies by gender?
Yes, if I can remember the ones that come from the top of my head, there were a lot of studies that had these, as I was mentioning, focus groups, and they would ask women farmers, how do you adapt your farms without considering the differences between crops, the differences between soils, the differences between women, all of these things. And so common strategies included things like using certain kinds of seed, certain agri inputs, growing certain crops instead of others. So a lot of on the farm adaptation strategies. Sometimes there were more broader community adaptation strategies. So they would adapt to changing climate through relying on community-oriented structures that would help them in times of need. Sometimes they would rely on state services for these things. Yeah, so a lot of the adaptation strategies are on the farm level itself, or maybe the community level, but very much focused on the individual farmer or the individual woman on her plots of land or on her husband's plots of land, her family farms. So that's, I mean, broadly the list, and they were very repetitive. So a lot of studies saying the same adaptation strategies, and it was almost like a counting exercise. So this women's group did 10 adaptation strategies. We consider that quite resilient. I mean, it's a little bit mind-boggling to me. Or they say, you know, these adaptation strategies that these women are doing they're not good enough, and therefore this makes them vulnerable. I mean, yeah, that's the extent of the analysis. So these seeds aren't good enough. These crops aren't good enough. The level of income and profit that they're making isn't good enough. Some of the studies did focus on a more climate smart level of adaptation. So they would see how many farmers were using a number of techniques. So intercropping, creating bonds to hold water, for instance, in very arid places, planting trees, these kinds of things. So very on the farm as well. But it's just focused on the technique level. There were a few studies that would measure yields and things, but very focused on the pragmatic technical side, which I think maybe gets at the earlier question around who's the purpose, the politics, what is this serving, kinds of discussion comes to mind.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next one. I'm going to come back to Rebecca because we had a question from her, and I want to ask Evaristo Mata's question. Okay, so I'm going to combine these two because they're almost okay. So Rebecca asked, could you give some examples of how you would design a study that addresses the deficits that you're describing in the existing literature? And then Evaristo says, question was similar to Rebecca's, your ideas for designing research which addresses your critique of the reviewed studies.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this for a long time because there's a lot of different directions you can go in. One thing that comes to mind is the speaker that was part of this discussion series last, they look at the politics of publishing, the politics of research, the politics of mixing scientists with, doing like agronomists with social scientists. And that's a very interesting place to start. There was a discussion of that. Of course, they were not focusing on climate change, but they were focusing on gender and agriculture and seed development. And so I think that might be an interesting place to start, just to see what's the gendering and the politics of research production itself. And that would be a different institutional analysis. That would be a different scalar analysis. There's other directions you could take, I think, as well. So working at regional scales would automatically lend itself to different kinds of studies. So looking at the policies of the region, the planning of the region, and relating it on to how communities more broadly, or leaders within the community, or even institutions across the region are incorporating gender dimensions as well. So not just individual women and men, but issues pertaining to differentiation. So one point about this, and I'm thinking of feminist political ecology scholarship, is to ask the questions, the classic political ecology questions of who owns what, who does what, and who benefits from that. And those are questions on social differentiation. Those require questions that get into the politics of use and ownership and power, that doesn't just focus on women and men, but important questions of class and how systems related to, for example, growth and capitalism gets at those sort of debates about whether we can have green growth, whether these models are working for or exacerbating power differentials between different communities, different places in the world, alongside gender. So it's not just women and men, but certain places, certain groups, certain classes of people as well. So I'm thinking of different scales, and it's not to say that you don't do research with women and men, of course not, but you could also include research on social movements who are trying to shift rights, shift laws, shift international agreements to work for those who are more vulnerable, studies in that level. And I think I'm an advocate for, based on this research, maybe shifting away from the structured methodologies and maybe towards more open-ended, grounded, participatory methodologies, starting at that place. And so would require a new research process as well to figure out which intersections of social dimensions matter most in particular contexts. Gender might not feature at the top. Perhaps there are others as well. So I'm sorry if that's a dissatisfying answer. The truth is that there are so many different ways that you could take this research. And the point being is that it needs to happen at different scales with institutions and not just the individuals or the households. Even communities, they matter as well in this on wider structures.
So I'm gonna put off my question unless we really actually have time for it. But I'd like to ask people who have not asked a question yet if they would like to raise their hand. I know a lot of the people who are on here, some of them have experience in the areas that you're talking about, and some that I don't know also have experience and are very interested. So as Lumbini just put in the chat, you can raise your hand, unmute yourself, and if you raise your hand first, so we don't have three people talking, but right now we don't have three people talking. So if somebody has a question or a comment, please raise your hand. Oh, Larry Vaughn, please unmute yourself and introduce yourself.
Thank you. I'm Larry Vaughn from the Center for International Research, Education and Development. I was interested in your characterization of the 26 studies you reviewed. Some of them were asking about perceptions by women and of climate change, and I think in a lot of places there's not a great awareness of what may be coming down the road people are facing. So that seems to be very important information. I was wondering if you could summarize how frequently it was that the populations that were being surveyed were unaware or were aware of the issue.
Good question. So my sense is perhaps a little bit different than what you're thinking, Larry. And I really appreciate your question because I think it's worth thinking through a little bit. My sense is that people, communities, especially those who are relying directly on their environments for their livelihoods, have a very good understanding of their environment. And they may not know quantifiably what's to come, but they have a very good historical sense as well about how their environments are changing and could change in the future. So they have a good sense of when there might be extreme climatic events. Maybe they can't tell you how extreme it will be or when precisely it will be coming, but I think that knowledge does shape their activities. They're constantly thinking about how people are thinking about how to minimize the risk to these shocks and stressors. But I think what's also important is about the politics of the environment, because their livelihoods or their interactions with the environment are also shaped by what's happening in politics or what's happening in the economy. So when they make certain adaptation strategies, it's with all of that in mind. So I am of this, I have the sense that women, men, people in general, especially those who rely on the land, have a good sense of what is happening and what's to come. But when it's a true shock, like what we see with the pandemic or with the war on Ukraine or extreme droughts like we see across East Africa, they may not know to that extent, or if they do have a sense that something is coming, they can't do anything about it because of the level of constraints that they are under. That's my sense. And then also it's been pretty well established in the literature broadly on gender and the environment and gender and climate change, is that because of different knowledge, different kinds of knowledge and values of the environment beyond principles of profit and growth and capitalism, is that people can actually do very well to conserve and protect and work with the environment as opposed to exploiting it. So their knowledge and values may differ from the kinds of structured observations or structured questions being asked in these research questionnaires. So that's what comes to mind with the question you asked, but I'm happy to discuss that and debate that a little bit further.
Thank you, Siera. I wasn't implying that people weren't sensitive or keenly aware of their own environment, but the causes of changes, not just having perceived change. But you had a slide there where you were discussing sort of where the blame goes, and the blame for global warming squarely doesn't lie with most of the communities that were being surveyed, but the consequences do. And understanding that is part of a power dynamic as well.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. So you only know what you know based on your own positionality. And so people who might not have access to information at wider, what's happening in the wider world, for example. And I even see this with a fault of my own research. When you're doing research at that community or individual or household level, and you're not necessarily looking at what's happening at wider scales, it's hard to know or get a sense of what the causes are. And I think the scholarship focusing on that one level is reinforcing the biases of what the potential cause is. And so what you actually see, and I'm thinking of a series of papers, for example, by Rachel Besner-Kerr, who has quite a bit featured in this broader scholarship. She talks about how this kind of scholarship is actually putting the blame on communities and individuals for their environmental changes. And as a result, participants are, because of the kinds of questions that are being asked to them, they are blaming themselves as well, and not necessary. And so it's actually, research is actually doing harm in that way. So it brings in wider questions of ethics as well, because oftentimes communities and households, this might be their only interaction with wider scales or points of reflections, opportunities to reflect, I mean. So, yeah.
Thank you. Siera and Larry, do you have anybody else raising their hand here? Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and ask my question is, without preamble, is how can we get more universities and funders of global North organizations that are funding development and climate change research in the global South? How can we get them to provide funding for and require open access publications? Because I mean, I just did a climate change gender adaptation and the fee is $3,400, and I'm still looking for. And of all the publications I've had, I've only been able to have one of our international projects once fund the publication. And I think it's outrageous that the people in the areas of the work have very limited access to the publications that we write from working with them.
Yes, it's mind-boggling. Do I have an answer to you? No, I have no idea. But what I do think is that it is happening in certain places. And so certain funders, I am thinking of SSHRC, the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council of Canada, where I get a lot of my research funding from, and Canadian academics get their social science funding from. They have a requirement to make sure you're funding or you're publishing open access articles. So that is one principle or value that they have and requirement they have in their research. The IDRC, which International Development Research Council of Canada, is a major funder for research in the Global South. And they have a requirement that when you apply for grants, that you have to have not just a collaborator or a partner in the respective countries where you're working, but that they have to be capable, and there has to be a plan for them actually receiving grant funds. I believe that's a requirement, or if it's not a precise requirement, it is certainly a major part of their evaluations for winning proposals. But as I had discussed with some of the project managers and directors at the IDRC about this research, and they're really leading on the gender and climate change, gender and agriculture scholarship in this area, at least in Canada, is that it's not actually enough to just give money to Global South institutions or African institutions. You actually have to have capacity building in the theories and diverse methodologies that exist, because a lot of scholars and universities have been, for lack of a better term, colonized. And so there actually needs to be capacity building in critical methodologies. So I think one thing that could be done is to have in every research grant a capacity building dimension of institutions, whether it's universities or multilateral institutes or whatever, a major capacity building element, as opposed to just extracting or getting information and publishing it. You're actually giving back to researchers, and not just communities, researchers themselves, and educating them. So I say this because there were a lot of these publications, a number, and I try and cite them in the paper, that are by African academics or people with African sounding names, because we can't actually track where everyone's coming from. And they're doing a lot of this research. And it's reinforcing the same sort of limited scope of methodology and analysis. And so I think there could be room, there is a need to do that, and open access is obvious. And I think a lot of scholars are sort of resisting the politics of publishing and the politics of large journal articles capturing that knowledge and the profits of that by publishing their materials where they can on their personal websites. Grant projects, I know, so I'm working as part of this research cluster, and they have a whole dimension to their project, which are creating open access storage on the university online systems that give all of their partners access to the publications that their involved faculty are producing and related faculty, and it's not in conflict with the publishers the way that we're doing it. So I think there is wider structural issues of why open access funding is so expensive and so constraining. There are also ways that we can adapt and overcome as well. So how to get universities to do it, maybe to remind scholars that there are other ways to overcome some of these big issues while also pushing for publishers to do differently.
So we have 2 more questions and we have 3 minutes. So I'm going to say Ann Oberhauser and Rebecca. Anne asked, why did you choose to study Africa? And are these reviews relevant to gender and climate studies from other regions?
I think it's a good question. Just briefly, I will mention, so we chose to study the continent of Africa because there seemed to be very limited, from our initial reading of the literature, limited focus on these places. So and even when I presented this research to other institutions, other places, they will bring up, well, how come this theme wasn't mentioned? What about all the research from the 1990s in this area? And it's because of place. So there's a huge amounts of information coming out of South Asia, coming out of Asia more broadly, coming out of Latin America, that does tackle themes at different scales, that does ask questions at different kinds of questions, different methodologies leading to different conclusions that are not featured in this literature, pointing to gaps between what's happening in the African continent and what's happening broader in the literature. That was my sense of going into this, and is only reinforced by reading the literature, and is only reinforced also by publishers approaching me saying, we want to publish this stuff. And like, who are the other scholars involved in this? Because there doesn't seem to be very much. So I know I didn't answer your question, Anne, specifically, but that's my sense broadly. And then Rebecca's question.
She had one more question. Did the literature you found focus mostly on a binary of man-woman and cisgender man-woman, or was there any research that looked at non-binary elements of gender studies?
I think, so what you're asking here is about diverse sexualities. That could be an assumption. There were very, very limited studies on intersectional dimensions, and even more broadly, multiple social positionalities. So what I'm thinking of or referring to are surveys where there is very little overlap and the classic demographic questions are asked. And even in the qualitative research, there were just comparisons between women and men, cisgender women and men. And in this context, very little on diverse sexualities. I don't think I can cross any study dealing with diverse sexualities. And that, again, it could be because of the limited types of research methodologies. And it is possible that if we focused on maybe research with indigenous knowledge or coming up with questions, sort of participatory oriented research, grounded theory, that diverse positionalities, diverse identities, diverse sexualities might come out. It is possible, but I did not read this in any of those studies.
Okay, well, I hate to bring this to a close. I want to thank everyone for attending, and thank you, Dr. Vercillo, for your wonderful presentation. We're sharing a short survey that we should be putting in the chat, and we'll also send it to everybody who registered or who attended. And your opinion is very important to us. We have some great speakers lined up for spring. We're actually going to do some hybrid things where public people like they will all be here unless something crazy like we've had in the past happens, but we're gonna try to keep them also through Zoom or some way so that we can keep this expanded geographical participation in our discussion series. So we're gonna have Emily Van Howling from Regis University, Jessica Spence, student here, Virginia Tech, and Nina Mukherjee first and now we're journalist and author. So see our website for more information. And we've got lots of thank yous, Sarah, in the chat. So I hope you have a chance to see this. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.